I bid you welcome, hope you enjoy the show. Hello, 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 hello. Claim your fortune, tell me what you've been told. Hello, 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 hello.
Blog Talk Radio.
American Nationalist Network. What is truth? With your host, Jim and Joe Rizoli.
Hello everyone, this is Jim and Joe Rizoli here. It's another Wednesday night, and Wednesday night is the show, What is Truth, our show. And we've been, talking about some really good topics for the last couple of weeks that, we feel that people should know about anyway. We talked about Joseph McCarthy last week. We talked about Charles Lindbergh the week before. We feel that, there are interesting topics of people that people out there in the audience should know about. And it's important. So this week we're talking about a subject matter that's a very controversial subject, obviously, especially with the nationalist movement in this country, and it has to do with slavery. And what we're going to do tonight, because we feel that sometimes it's best just dealing with information that's already out there. We have two videos. They're 9 minutes apiece, the videos, but we're going to play them as audio here. You'll hear them as audio. David Duke had one actually excellent video on, it's called actually The Jews and Slavery. But he explains about slavery in general, and I just thought it was a really good video. And we thought we'd use it just to kind of set the stage here tonight. And there's two sides of this. There's two videos that, when one ends, I'll play the other one. It might repeat a little bit on the second one, but that's fine. But I think you'll appreciate it. I think you'll find it very interesting. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take up where he leaves off, okay, and bring out some points, obviously, that he's not bringing out or hasn't brought out there. Because you can't bring out all the points. I mean, it's just impossible, within the time element we have here. So let's go to the video for the audio for David Duke right now. And we all know who he is. He did a great job with this video. It's probably one of the best around. And we'll be back when this one ends. It's 9 minutes. We'll pick up on the other one, and then we'll come in after that. So let's go to David Duke right now.
Hello, this is David Duke. Other than war, no institution of recorded history has violated more human rights, caused more deaths, more suffering than that of slavery. Although slavery still exists in parts of Africa and other parts of the world, the last great trafficking in human slaves occurred in bringing Africans to the New World, beginning in the early 16th century and flourishing up to the middle years of the 19th century. The most egregious, cruel, and murderous aspect of this period was the transatlantic slave trade, often called the Middle Passage. Scholarly studies of the loss of life during the transportation of slaves to the Americas suggest that between 7 and 10 million Africans suffered indescribable cruelty and perished in the Middle Passage. The human suffering and death from the African slave trade is the cornerstone of white guilt, both in America and around the world, and has been tirelessly promoted by both academic and popular media. The film Amistad by Steven Spielberg is the cinematic standard of films about the slave trade, and a more recent treatment is the excellent film called Amazing Grace. Amistad carefully portrays the slave trade as a Christian European-American enterprise. It is terribly unflattering portrayals of American leaders, the Queen of Spain, and conspicuously Christian slave traders. It has numerous images of Christian crosses accompanied by scenes of horrific treatment of black slaves. Before Amistad, though, in 1992, the Nation of Islam caused a tremendous controversy when it published the book The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews. It quoted prominent Jewish historians who claimed that the African slave trade, and indeed slavery in the West, for the last 2,000 years, was thoroughly dominated by the Jewish community. Now, 15 years before the publication, I appeared on the largest black talk show in America and for the first time exposed the issue before a national audience. As strange as it might seem to some of you, in spite of my politics, I had a role in setting in motion the rising black awareness on this issue. 5 years after The Secret Relationship was published, Amistad was made. I think it was perhaps a remedial effort to put the genie back in the bottle. It was set in a thoroughly Christian New England. The actual center of the American slave trade was at Newport, Rhode Island. It is no minor coincidence that Newport had America's oldest synagogue and was home of the largest thriving Jewish community in the New World. Although Spielberg portrayed the horrific slave trade as thoroughly a Christian affair, here are some words of the major Jewish history of the early Americas called New World Jewry. It's by S.B. Liebman and the American Jewish Historical Society. He wrote about those who owned and manned the ships, the perpetrators of this mass human cruelty and murder. Quote, "They came with ships carrying African blacks to be sold as slaves. The traffic in slaves was a royal monopoly, and the Jews were often appointed as agents for the crown in their sale. They, the Jews, were the largest ship chandlers in the entire Caribbean region, where the shipping business was mainly a Jewish enterprise. The ships were not only owned by Jews, but were manned by Jewish crews and sailed under the command of Jewish captains." Now here's how I came to discuss the Jewish slave trade on Black Perspectives in the News on PBS. In the late 60s, I became acquainted with a slave trade researcher by the name of Walter White. He wrote a short booklet called Who Brought the Slaves to America? I contacted him and began doing my own research into the slave trade. I've read all of the official Jewish histories pertaining to it. I've followed the issue for over 25 years now, scanning official Jewish general histories on the subject, and often those histories were published by Jewish historical societies and groups. These were histories written by Jews for Jews, and here's some direct quotes from the leading Jewish historians writing about the African slave trade. Now remember, you can find all the academic citations in my books, My Awakening and Jewish Supremacism. Prominent Jewish historian Mark Raphael, in his book Jews and Judaism in the United States, a documentary history, wrote, quote, "Jewish merchants played a major role in the slave trade. In fact, in all the American colonies, whether French, Martinique, British, or Dutch, Jewish merchants frequently dominated." This was no less true on the North American mainland, where during the 18th century Jews participated in the triangular trade that brought slaves from Africa to the West Indies and there exchanged them for molasses, which in turn was taken to New England and converted into rum for sale in Africa. Isaac da Costa of Charleston in the 1750s, David Franks of Philadelphia in the 1760s, and Aaron Lopez of Newport in the late 1760s and early 1770s dominated Jewish slave trading on the American continent. Jewish historians record old Jewish documents showing how the slave trade was so thoroughly Jewish that slave auctions throughout the Americas had to close on Jewish holidays. Brazil received far more African slaves than North America. A. Witzner, another official of the Jewish Historical Society, in his book Jews in Colonial Brazil, pages 72 and 73, wrote, quote, "The buyers who appeared at the auctions were almost always Jews, and because of their lack of competitors, they could buy slaves at low prices. If it happened that the date of such an auction fell on a Jewish holiday, the auction had to be postponed. Studying the Jewish histories of the New World, I began to learn of a carefully recorded Jewish history that you and I are not permitted to know about. I discovered that many centuries before the transatlantic slave trade, that Jews had dominated the slave trade in the entire Western world for the last 2,000 years, even as far back as Roman times. Duncan Wagnall's Jewish Encyclopedia, in Volume 10, page 48, writes, quote, "The trade in slavery constituted the main source of livelihood for the Roman Jews." To show you how widespread the Jewish slave trade was and how influential Jews seduced authorities centuries ago, just as they do in modern America and around the world, in the 5th century, Pope Gelasius permitted Jews to introduce slaves from Gaul into Italy on the condition that they were non-Christian. In the 8th century, Charlemagne explicitly allowed the Jews to act as intermediaries in the slave trade. In A History of the Jews from Babylonian Exile to the End of World War II, published by the Jewish Publication Society of America, the author writes, quote, "The Jews were among the most important slave dealers in European society." And here's a quote from the famous Jewish historian Jacob Marcus in the Encyclopedia Britannica. He matter-of-factly talks about the Jewish control of commerce in the Middle Ages. Quote, "In the Dark Ages, the commerce of Western Europe was largely in his hand, in particular, the slave trade." Not only were Jews the principal slave traders, they had markedly higher per capita holdings of slaves than did non-Jews. Jacob Marcus wrote in the United States Jewry, 1776-1985, page 586, quote, "All through the 18th century into the early 19th, Jews in the North were to own black servants. In 1820, over 75% of the Jewish families in Charleston, Richmond, and Savannah owned slaves. Almost 40% of all Jewish householders in the United States owned one slave or more." The actual fact is that even in the South, less than 5% of white people owned slaves. Less than 2% of whites owned slaves in all of pre-Civil War America, while 40% of Jewish householders owned slaves. Now notice how only guilt is ascribed for white people in slavery, even though Jews were 2,000% more likely to own black slaves than was any white Gentile person. When I broached some of these facts on Black Perspectives in the News, the host was fascinated. And the underlying question is why there is a collective white guilt assigned for the slave trade, but no collective Jewish guilt. Why are black Americans or white Americans not allowed to know who the primary slave traders were? The Anti-Defamation League and other Jewish organizations discovered that I had documented the dominant Jewish role in the American slave trade, and they were desperate to prevent this historical truth from reaching a wide audience. Jewish leaders, Saul Rosen, Harry Bass, Peter Munchik, filed an injunction in the Common Pleas Court in Philadelphia asking the judge to block the program. The Jewish judge, Stanley Greenberg, then ordered that the program not be aired unless he approved it.
It would take more than a man to lead the slaves from bondage. It would take a god.
So that was part one, and I'm gonna play part two right now of this audio. Technically, it's a video, but it might repeat just a little bit. But I'm gonna play it right now. I gotta click on it, so just bear with me here. Let's see what we're going to do here. And here we go.
While Jewish Hollywood portrayed the Jews as fighting against the concept of human slavery and for freedom and human dignity, it just didn't happen to mention the fact that the Hebrews, while still in Egypt, according to the book of Exodus, had slaves too. Now here's a quote from Leviticus in the Old Testament showing the true Jewish view on slavery, proclaiming that Gentile slaves must be a Jewish inheritance forever and that it's permitted to treat them cruelly, but never to treat Jews in such harsh ways. As for your male and female slaves, whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are round about you. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You may make slaves of them, but over your own brethren, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another with harshness. For simply quoting that verse from the Bible, my friend Sam Francis lost his job as an editorial writer in the Washington Times. Thank God that with the coming of Jesus, the Word of God, at least for Christians, became one of love and kindness. Only problem is that organized Jewry rejected and hated Jesus and the love and reconciliation that he taught. The practice and the edicts of Leviticus continued on down through the years until the slave trade was outlawed by Europeans in the 19th century. Newsweek and Time did stories about the Amistad movie and matter-of-factly stated that myths about Jewish control of the slave trade are simply just that, an anti-Semitic canard. Unfortunately, most of Newsweek's readers were not told what prominent Jewish historians themselves wrote about the matter before it became an embarrassing issue. Ironic, isn't it? Before it became a shameful issue, Jewish historians were bragging of their control of the lucrative slave trade in their own histories for their own people. But when it became an embarrassment, after people like me exposed it, now they say, oh, this is just anti-Semitism. While whites are immersed in collective guilt for black slavery by the Jewish-controlled media, that same media parcels out not one iota of collective Jewish guilt for the horrific transatlantic slave trade that constituted a true Holocaust that exceeded the most liberal estimates of the Jewish lives lost in the Second World War. It's also important to note that slavery existed on the African continent from the beginning of time. It is true that many whites, as well as many African blacks, engaged in the slave trade, and that's a scar on the history of both our peoples. But it's also true that it was the European people themselves who ended not only the slavery and slave trade of blacks by whites and Jews, but also stopped most of the slavery existing among African blacks. The British and American Gentiles who courageously fought to end slavery and the slave trade, they had to go against Jewish financial power and political influence which fought tooth and nail to preserve the nefarious enterprise in human flesh and suffering. It should be a badge of honor on Europeans in both England and America that they moved to outlaw the slave trade in spite of Jewish pressure and power. Blacks suffered for almost 300 years of Jewish-dominated slave trading, and tens of millions of European whites and others have suffered greatly for at least 2,000 years. The Jewish-dominated media from Hollywood to New York continue to wash the nation and the world with white guilt for slavery, while washing away any collective guilt of the people who hold the world's records for the slave trade since at least the time of the Romans. Now, why do they seek to instill guilt in our people, you might ask? The answer is clearly that the Jewish tribe sought to replace the ruling class of America and other European nations with their own people, and they understood that anything they could do to introduce guilt or shame upon their enemies, anything that would lessen their enemies' sense of loyalty and love of their own heritage, would weaken their resistance to Jewish power. And of course, the Jewish supremacists, they succeeded in replacing the old ruling class. They're the new ruling class of America, of Britain, of France, and Europe. Through their Fed and World Bank and IMF and globalist media and their political bribery in groups such as AIPAC and others, they've become more powerful than their wildest dreams. European peoples engaged in slavery, as have all other peoples on earth, but we should understand that at times tens of millions of our own became victimized by slavery. But Europeans are saddled by the Jewish media and unique guilt and self-hate for slavery, when the truth is that Europeans, at least, not only acted to end slavery in their own nations, but fought to eradicate it all over the earth. In sharp contrast to this, the people who have been the biggest champions of this repugnant trade in human suffering for the last 2,000 years, and who have fought tooth and nail to preserve it, don't have a trace of guilt. Not a trace of guilt is permitted. They must always appear as victims and never perpetrators. But times have changed. You've experienced only the tip of the iceberg of the Jewish domination of many kinds of human exploitation. I could talk about the modern white slave trade and millions of Eastern European women enslaved by these people, and it's by the same old tribal malevolence. So you see, it's not just the Palestinians who face the evils of Jewish supremacism. I talk about these issues not because I hate or want to harm Jews. I oppose human exploitation or suppression or hatred against anyone. Among the Jewish people, there are decent people, and it's time for them to end this hypocrisy, to clean up their act. Too long has the Jewish establishment of power sheltered and facilitated the worst violators of human exploitation. Modern Israel is the modern expression of the types of human oppressions and exploitation, torture, murder, and ethnic cleansing practiced in their history of the slave trade. Unfortunately, only a few courageous Jews like Gilad Atzmon and Israel Shamir fight this power, and I salute them. And I thank you. People often ask me, how can we change things? These are incredible facts. Now, what do we do about it? And what we do about it is spread this truth, change the consensus, defend our heritage, and to fight for justice for our own people and for all people. That's what we do about it. One person at a time. Spread this video. Spread the truth. Tell the truth. Be courageous. And we will change the world.
Okay, so that was David Duke. That was a two-part series. Actually, it's on YouTube. If you want to look at that video, just do a search, David Duke and the Slave Trade, and that will come up. And I thought you did an excellent job with that. Now, the other side of this that we're going to be talking about, Joe has a book here that is going to go a little deeper into it, and it's called, well, Joe, maybe you can just take over and start explaining about your book.
Well, there's a couple of books, actually, that deal with the slavery in America. I happen to get this book. It's called Before the Mayflower, A History of Black America by Leron Bennett Jr. Now, this is an interesting book because I've been having a conversation with another brother of mine, and my brother seems to be the... I don't know what it is. I think he's the poster boy for black people or something.
He's a liberal, Joe. What do you want?
He's very liberal.
That's what he is. He's a liberal.
And he just thinks that the blacks have had terrible things done to them, which things have been done to the blacks, like they've been done to everybody in the history of mankind. And he, in an email, he said to me, he goes, I wonder if you only retained from this only what you wanted to support your point of view. This did not happen overnight. Blacks have been oppressed since the 1600s. And I'm saying to myself, well, wait a minute here. Now, I just got a book called Before the Mayflower, A History of Black America. And I'm like, wait a minute. He's saying that the blacks have been oppressed since the 1600s. All right. Now, in this book, and I'm not, I just started reading it. But, I mean, the pages that I've read opened my eyes. I'm like, I can't believe what I've read here. According to this book, now you got to remember, this person who wrote this book is a black man, and my brother said that this person who wrote it was biased and was racist. I'm saying, well, maybe you should check out a few videos of Leron Bennett Jr. on YouTube, and you're going to find out that he's not white. So apparently, I guess blacks can write about their own history and actually tell the truth. At the beginning of the book, I don't really agree with a lot of things because this guy's trying to prove, blacks in Egypt and, that whole bit. That's all up for debate, this is according to their interpretation because they see on some of the mummies and the statues, fat lips and all that, or what they think are fat lips or whatever. So, in the conversations with him, I said, "Oh, well, John," I goes, "here's an interesting point about blacks. Now, you got to remember, when did blacks first come to America? Now, according to this book, what happened was the first black immigrants, and their name was Atone Isabella, and they were part of a Jamestown group. They were not slaves. They came into Jamestown, I guess apparently because the boat the guy who was running the boat had to come to this place, and he was looking for food. So he exchanged, the people for food, and he left these people. Now they were not slaves. See, this is the big thing. They found in this instance that these people were what's called indentured servants. And so what happens is on page 35 of the book it says, in Virginia, then as in other colonies, the first black settlers fell into a well-established socio-economic groove which carried with it no implications of racial inferiority. It says that came later, but in the interim, a period of 40 years or more, the first black settlers accumulated land, voted, testified in court, and mingled with whites on a basis of equality. They owned other black servants, and certain blacks imported and paid for white servants whom they apparently had in servitude. So, I've never read anything like that before. And remember, this is written by a black author. And so it goes on to say, because remember, we're dealing with the 1600s. My brother John said, well, they've been oppressed since the 1600s. Well, according to further on page 37, if you want to look up this man's name, his name is Anthony Johnson. He came to America in 1621. It said he started accumulating property. And it said in 1651, according to official records, he imported and paid for 5 servants, some of whom were white, and was granted 250 acres of land on the basis of a headright system, which permitted planters to claim 50 acres of land for each individual brought into the colony. So these are the official records. When you go into the official records, going back to the 1600s, and then it said years later, in 1652, John Johnson, who was probably Anthony Johnson's son, imported 11 persons, most of them white males and females, and received headrights for 550 acres adjacent to Anthony Johnson. So these are all in the records, and I'm like, you got to be kidding me, because I'm thinking maybe the 1700s and the 1800s, but when you think about it, the first probably the first 150 years. There was really no problem with slavery. My personal opinion, this is my opinion, it wasn't until the Jews, as like David Duke brought out in some of his stuff, to me, it wasn't until they started getting their hands into things, and then this whole thing of real bad, real slavery of these people came into being. But anyway, here's some points that are brought out further on in the book. It says, one can hardly doubt in the face of clear evidence that the first generation of blacks had, as J.H. Russell noted, about the same industrial or economic opportunities as a free white servant. Additional evidence of the relatively high status of the first American blacks is to be found in colonial documents which indicated that they voted and participated in public life. It was not until 1723, in fact, blacks were denied the right to vote in Virginia. So that's the point I was making. It wasn't until much, much later, I think, when the Jewish influence came into all these states, that things started to be taken away, and the power play of who were the merchants and who owned the boats and all that came into power. But it did say here, it says not only did pioneer blacks vote, but they also held public office. There was a black surety in York County, Virginia, in the first decades of the 17th century, and a black beadle, B-E-A-D-L-E, in Lancaster County, Virginia. It says, and it wasn't just confined to Virginia. It says the first blacks in Massachusetts, they arrived in 1638 on the boat Desire, and that was America's first slave ship, and they were apparently assigned the status of indentured servants. Of course, for all us people who want to look into history, the people that owned that book, I believe, were Jewish.
You mean the boat?
The boat, I mean, yes, right. So it says it was in a classic work called The Negro in Colonial New England, Lorenzo J. Green said that until almost the end of the 17th century, the records referred to the Negroes as servants and not slaves. And so it just goes on. You know, see, this all was all new to me because, like I said, you know, I'm from, you know, we've been brainwashed for all these years, and particularly when you hear, you know, these blacks that they keep complaining about, we want to get reparations. You know, we want to get reparations for slavery and what happened to the slavery. Well, if you go back to the original days in the 60s, the earliest days of slavery, maybe the blacks should be paying us reparations, because it seems like everything that happened was the opposite of what history has told us. So when these people start, you know, giving me the, you know, pulling out the violin and sob stories about reparations and
it's reparations
and their lot in life and all that stuff, you know, I like, oh, come on, please, you know, take hold of your own life. Don't blame it on something that happened, you know, 250 years ago, 300 years ago. That's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, but what I get out of it is that their oppression it really came when the Jews started to control all the businesses and all those type of things. That's when it seems like things really went awry for the blacks. So before that, the blacks seemed like they were just more or less workers. You know, workers on a farm or workers whatever. And some of them were the people that owned the farm. Or did you know, had people working under them too. So I don't know. It's crazy how it's all come down to today.
Well, it indicates too that, you know, in this book it said here that I thought this was interesting. It said white women not only worked in the fields but were flogged at colonial whipping post. So even white people were they see my philosophy is slavery really has nothing to do with race. Slavery has to do with the economics of the system and the people that run the system. It could be any color, and as was brought out, you know, about whites. If, for instance, let's see my book here. I got it in a second. I got a book here. This was by Michael. Well, I'll read the title. They were white and they were slaves. The Untold History of the Enslavement of Whites in Early America. And this is by Michael Hoffman, and he brings out really like interesting points about, you know, same thing about slavery. It says here that well, in the early parts of his book, he says, "Who wants to be reminded?" This is not quoting from someone. I'll read that. It says, "Who wants to be reminded that half, perhaps as many as 2/3 of the original American colonists came here not on their own free will, but kidnapped, shanghaied, impressed, duped, beguiled, and yes, in chains. We tend to gloss over it. We prefer to forget the whole story." And I thought it was interesting. You know, have you ever heard of the word kidnapped? Well, originally, kidnap, it means kid nabbed, and this is what happened in Britain a lot. It says the stealing of white children into slavery in America, practiced on a mass scale as a virtual industry in the British Isles in the 17th and 18th centuries. So that book or that movie Kidnapped does not have to do with a black or blacks at all. It had to do with whites, and that's what the name means. They took people like kids off the street, kidnapped them, and brought them in the slave ships into America, and they were dealt with, or even they say worse than the black servants. And you know, it's just brought out so many much more times. But you're not going to hear this from the ADL or the Southern Poverty Law Center, because they got to keep the blacks, you know, with their little slave
stories.
Yes, their slave stories.
Well, what it seems like to me is the whole black experience in this country has to be, from their viewpoint anyway, a bad deal, okay? And the whites were responsible for it. Now, what I understand by what I'm seeing here is that if you can prove blacks had slaves and whites were slaves, then we have a problem here, because it all didn't center around the blacks. And I think it's very bothersome to me anyway when you think about, people when they call them. So what do you want to be called? Black, African American? Oh, African American. And I'm saying to myself, how do you figure that one out? I mean, do your grandparents and great grandparents go back to Africa? You'd be surprised. The majority of them don't, and a lot of them just are back to the United States where they were. I mean. It's funny when you really trace it right back, the genealogy, how it goes back or where it goes back. In other words, the blacks, a lot of the blacks mixed with the whites, and the blacks today are offspring of that mixture, and a lot of them don't want to accept that.
Right. So anyways, when you continue to read some of the stuff in the books, it says here, we cannot be sure that the position of the earliest Africans differed markedly from that of the white indentured servants. The debate has considerable significance for the interpretation of race relations in America's history. And that was in the book Roll, Jordan Roll, The World the Slaves Made by Eugene D. Genovese. So, remember I was bringing up the point that slavery has nothing to do with color. If you go back into the Roman days, it said Julius Caesar enslaved as many as 1 million whites from Gaul, some of whom were sold to the slave dealers who followed his victorious legions. And that's by a book by William D. Phillips, Jr., and it's called Slavery from Roman Times to the Early Transatlantic Trade, page 18. So, another point which I thought was brought out here, and people, there's a lot of people that are making the Muslims poster childs too. A lot of people in our truth movement, or whatever you want to call it, they're terrific when it comes to exposing Jews and what the Jews have done in history, and Jews and slavery and all this. But little is the fact what happened in the Muslim world. Now let me read this. It says, Arabs, this is on page 8 of Michael Hoffman's book, They Were White and They Were Slaves. He says, Arabs and the traffic in white slaves. He goes, at the same time that France was a transfer point for slaves to the Muslim world, Italy was occupying much the same position. Venetians were selling slaves and timber across the Mediterranean. The Slavs were usually Slavs brought across the Alps. The Venetians were the earliest successful Italian sea traders, and because profits on slave trade with the Muslims were lucrative, they resisted efforts to stop them in return for their exports of timber, iron, and white slaves. They brought in Oriental luxury products, mainly fine clothes. And that was by a man named William Phillips, and on his book, page 6063. It says, oh yeah, and here's an interesting point. Notice what it says. The slaves were usually Slavs. Now, where do you think we got the word slave from? Okay? And the Slavs were white. So the original word for slave, it comes from Slav, and they weren't black, they were white. So I think that was pretty pretty interesting. Michael Hoffman, in his book, They Were White and They Were Slaves, it's 130 something pages, and if you get a chance to read that, it's really a good book to just fill in all the blanks and all the things you're not going to really see in history about what's happened with slaves. The story. Let's put it that way: the story of slavery. I have here.
Let me just make a point. If anybody wants to call in, the call-in number is 951-729-8933. If you have any of your own opinions about this.
Right. In another, Michael Hoffman has quite a bit of history. He wrote that book, but he brings out. Let me see here. Oh no, I already brought up that point about the word, where the word Slav comes. It just says those academics who insist that slavery is exclusively black, is an exclusively black racial condition forget, or deliberately omit, that the fact that the word slave originally was a reference to whites of East European origin. S-L-A-V-S. So, that was, I thought, a good point that he brought up. And there was more. There was another book that I have, and I'm not sure how far into this I am here. But there's a book here called Jews, Slaves, and the Slave Trade, Setting the Record Straight by Ellie Faber, F-A-B-E-R. And this indicates just, slavery, how it came in all through. You can remember, the Africans, they didn't care. See, they had war with other tribes. And when they won, the booty was people. So when England and the British came, that booty was exchanged for goods, and that's how people were exchanged. So the blacks could care less about the blacks, and in fact they were prominent people in the slave trade who were.
Well, the blacks in Africa obviously exploited their own people because, again, they're all black over there, so they have to exploit someone. So wherever the country is, it could be whites suppressing the whites as slaves, or in Africa they're black, so they had the black people being slaves. So when you're dealing economics here and you're trading things off, you trade whatever your goods are. If you have people, then you trade the people for the goods, and the opposite works. So that's how it worked there.
Right.
Oh, go ahead.
And you also got to remember, the economic times and how, like, for instance, if you were in Britain, one of the big things they had, of course, everybody used fireplaces and they used wood or coal or whatever, and some of the things that they had to clean out were the chimneys. And it says here in Michael Hoffman's book that thousands of white children in Great Britain were forced to work as human brooms inside chimney flues, and led miserable lives and died horrid deaths. The condition of these chimney sweepers reveals perhaps more than any other form of white slavery the attitude of the ruling class toward the most defenseless and oppressed segment of the surplus white poor. So we can see that what they used to do with it. I mean, the kids were really teeny, small little kids, and they could get up into the flues and they could clean out the chimneys, but unfortunately, some of them couldn't get out of the flues, and they could never get them out, and they died. And but that was a huge thing back in Britain and England. And what happened is that it said here, parish officials tried to get rid of pauper children as soon as they were old enough, by apprenticing them to any master who would take them. These included the masters of chimney sweeps, for whom thin, malnourished boys as young as 4 were considered ideal for the facility of entering narrow smoke channels.
Well, the thing you have to remember too, in those days, all the buildings were built of wood. The houses were heated with wood, and those chimneys were probably the most important part of that house, the maintenance of that house. So every single person that had a chimney in that house, or several chimneys in that house, because every bedroom, probably a lot of bedrooms would have them too, they had to be cleaned probably once or twice or whatever, at least I would think, a year. So that had to be a huge booming business. And according to what Hoffman says in his book, that was all serviced by the white slaves in England.
Right.
Apparently, according to him, right?
Right. Now, I got my pen in my mouth here. This is good. Listen to this. It says, it was not uncommon to send the children up the chimneys while the chimneys were still on fire, or to place flaming straw in the grate beneath the child who had entered the chimney, but refused to go up all the way. Skeletal deformities and crippling were common, as were fatal accidents. An eyewitness account tells of a boy called to a job that needed to be done in haste. The child entered the flue, but quickly came out again, saying it was too hot. The master told him to make as much haste as he could. He was taking too long of a time, and they heard him crying out. And he was hung to a nail, and they heard him crying and sobbing very near 9 o'clock, having been up about 20 minutes, and they never heard him anymore. And then they sent another boy after him that reached his toes, and they couldn't pull him down. And so I guess he was wedged in the flue, and it was really hot. And it said here the flue was 14 inches by 12, and that in soot and heat, the biller testified must have caused the boy's death. Yeah, gee, I wonder how come, huh? But here's an interesting point. It says the boys who escaped death often contracted cancer. And in 1775, Percival Pott observed an overwhelming number of young chimney sweeps suffering from scrotal cancer. He believed that the horrendous disease of these malnourished boys, kept thin by their employers to fit down the chimneys, was caused by their constant exposure to soot. But the English government took more than 50 years to pass laws to protect them. Imagine that. I mean, the kids got cancer.
So the blacks complained because they worked picking cotton out in the field. But how many of these black come down with scrotum cancer? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. You're gonna see a black. Hey, you want a job? I want you to go up in the chimney. Hey, no, man, I'm not going up your chimney.
Yeah, right.
I mean, come on.
Well, I don't think too many of them would fit up in it anyway.
Right.
Especially where they eat today.
I'd rather sell cocaine.
Yeah, right. Well, I wanted to bring a couple points. You done with that book? Or you got some more? I wanted to bring a point up. If you ever get a chance, you folks out there, go to the Brown University website, and you're going to find some very interesting information because Brown University is in Rhode Island. And in Rhode Island, Brown University basically was their founder, all right. His name was Brown, obviously, but he was involved with the slave trade, and people don't understand that a lot of these colleges and a lot of these people that were really big and high up in these colleges, they were involved in the slave trade too. But I thought that this was an interesting point under the subheading "Slavery and Trade in Rhode Island." It said that Rhode Island played a leading role in the transatlantic slave trade, and it says. Let me see the point. The point I want to make this point here. In New England, okay, just to step back a bit. In New England, the first slaves in New England, it says, were the Native Americans. All right, so there you go. If anybody has a beef about slavery, it would be the Native Americans. So what happened was, when these Native Americans were captured in war, all right, they were made prisoners. They would be taken on boats, and they would be taken, to other ports, all right, and they were sold or traded for black slaves. Imagine that. So it said here in 1638, William Pierce, a Boston ship captain, took several captive Pequot Indians to the West Indies to sell into slavery. In exchange for these captives, Pierce brought back salt, cotton, tobacco, and Africans. And that's unbelievable when you think about it. So the first slaves in America, okay, the first slaves in America were actually the indigenous Indians, and they were the ones that were used first. And of course, once they were all used up, then they started bringing in the blacks from these other countries. Go ahead, Jay. You want to finish up on that?
Well, I have an article here. This came out of the magazine Barnes Review. It's called Dixie's Censored Subject, Black Slave Owners by Robert M. Grooms, Grooms. And he brings out an interesting point here. He says, this is the point I thought was interesting, of all the blacks who owned their own slaves. When you tell people this, especially blacks, they don't believe it. but it's like, oh, that's the history. It says, he says, there's a period where blacks who owned slaves. These includes individuals such as Justice Angel and Mistress L. Horry of Colleton District, South Carolina, who each owned 84 slaves in 1830. And in fact, in 1830, a fourth of the free Negro slave masters in South Carolina owned 10 or more slaves, 8 owning 30 or more. Now remember that, a fourth of the free Negro slaves owned slaves.
Well, if we take that a step further here, David Duke said only 5% of the whites in the South owned slaves, 40% of the Jews owned slaves, so we have 25% of the blacks who were free blacks, they owned slaves. So that's a pretty big percentage of people.
This is even higher. It says here, the country's leading African-American historian, Duke University professor John Hope Franklin, records that in New Orleans, over 3,000 free Negroes owned slaves. 28% of the free Negroes in the city owned slaves. Well, that's the 1/4.
Yeah,
that's the 1/4. 25%. This is 28%.
Right.
He says.
So we can say average it out. 25% of the blacks own slaves.
Right. It says, to return to the census figures quoted above, this 28% is certainly impressive when compared to less than 1.4% of all whites and less than 4.8% of Southern whites. So it shows that when free, blacks disproportionately became slave masters. And it goes on here. Remember, this article is called Dixie's Censored Subject, Black Slave Owners by Robert M. Grooms, Grooms. It says here, further on, it says, in 1860, there were at least 6 Negroes in Louisiana who owned 65 or more slaves. The largest number, 152 slaves, were owned by the widow C. Richards and her son P.C. Richards, who owned a large sugarcane plantation. Another slave magnate in Louisiana with over 100 slaves was Antione Duboulet, a sugar planter whose estate was valued at $264,000, and that was in 1860. That year, in other words, what I was saying is that's a lot of wealth. In Charleston, South Carolina.
Yeah, but bring that point out there.
Right. This year.
Well, his estate was worth he was worth $264,000, but somebody who was wealthy, a Southern white man, was worth about $4,000.
Right.
I mean, so in other words, if you had $4,000 and you were a white man, that was considered wealthy, and this guy had $264,000.
Oh yeah, 60 times.
His estate was valued at that, I should say.
Right. In Charleston, South Carolina, in 1860, 125 free Negroes owned slaves, 6 of them owning 10 or more. So, as you can see, the whole topic of slavery takes in the fact that the biggest owners were blacks and Jews, if you really get down to it. In his book, Irvin L. Jordan Jr. writes that as the Great Conflagration of 1861 to 1865 approached, which would have been the Civil War, free African Virginians were a nascent black middle class under siege, but several acquired property before and during the war. Approximately 169 free blacks owned 145,976 acres in the counties of Amelia, Amherst, Isle of Wight, Nassau, Prince William, and Surrey, averaging 870 acres each. So it just shows you that, of course, acquiring all this property, you need to require people to work on the property, and obviously, the biggest things would have been their own people, would have been the people in slavery.
All right, well, let's just kind of sum it up. So basically what we try to show you today is that the blacks can complain all they want about being slaves, and my older brother can complain all about the blacks being oppressed.
According to him, I'm racist.
But, I mean, here's the whole thing. I mean, hey, the blacks were used as slave labor, okay? Like the whites have been used as slave labor. Everybody has been used in slave labor throughout the centuries. That's the way it is, okay? And for the blacks to jump on this to make it look like this was their only problem and affected only them, I find it very disingenuous. It's not really showing the whole picture. So what you can walk away from this tonight is that approximately 25% of the blacks owned slaves. Okay, if you can remember that, that's very important. All right, and 40% of the Jews owned slaves, and only 5% or less of whites.
Well, it's at 1.4 even.
Well, David Duke said 5% of whites.
Yeah.
Oh, we'll go with the high figure. 5% of whites owned slaves. All right, so we can see that the truth isn't being talked about this, and I think what's happening here is they want to pit the whites against the blacks because you have to have an enemy, and the blacks have to have whites as their enemy. They don't realize that the Jews are really their enemy. They're the ones that got the whole mercantile business going, and they were using the blacks, to work for them. And they don't get that picture yet. They just look at whites as being whites. They don't look at them as being a religious viewpoint like Jews. And we're just trying to tell people that the Jews ran the slave trade, and now today they're pitting the whites. Not the whites, actually. They're pitting the blacks against the whites because a lot of blacks are unhappy about the past. But, of course, how many blacks today are in slavery? We don't see that today. Now, if you want to compare them working as being slaves, like all of us are that do work, we are all slaves because if we're working for somebody, we're a slave. It's just another term for it today. Okay? We get paid for it. Back in those days, they got paid for it too. They had room, shelter, and food, and they were taken care of. And if they were abused, which I'm sure some were, that's what happens. I mean, it does happen. Abuse happens, and there's not much you can do. Well, to sum it up, Joe, we don't have much time.
Well, it's like the Holocaust. They take these stories and they blow them way out of proportion,
right?
And they make a whole big thing about it.
Right.
So
right. So as the Jews have taken the Holocaust, they make it look like something that only affected them. The blacks have taken their history of the slave trade, and they make it look like they got the patent on suffering there. And who suffers in the end? The whites. All right, the whites suffer because we're the ones who are made to look like the bad guys, and that's what they want to happen. But again, use this information, show people that, again, there's more to it out there, and hopefully you appreciate that. Well, listen, that pretty much sums up our show for tonight. Next week we'll have another show for you. Hopefully you'll be there to listen. And anything, Joe, you want to say?
Well, I got plenty of stuff to dig up. I got some good books that I can refer to and set you straight, because you remember this show is called What is Truth. That's right. And we try to give you the truth.
10 seconds.
All right, everyone. It was nice being with you tonight, and we'll see you next week. Take care now.
See you later.
Hello, hello. I bid you welcome, hope you enjoy the show. Hello, hello. Hello, hello. Claim your fortune, tell me what you've been told. Hello,